Hello and welcome to our final panel for the Conversations on Inclusivity workshop. We are really excited to have our last conversation on the topic of disability and the human body. Today, our guest speakers will be presenting their work and the different ways that the body can relate to the built environment. We have with us, hopefully, Sean Alquist, Alexa Vanguard Bernard, Ava Aganakachuk, Rachel Dickey, and Jonathan Duckworth, who is not here with us live because he's in Australia, but has sent a video of his work for us to watch as well. This panel is part of this larger discussion into how today we confront change in our built environments with things that are social, political, racial, and create equity and empathy within our built environment. And to start these panels off, we have set up a list of prompts. So for disability and the human body, we're really interested in how we can explore non-standard bodies and how we design for and with them. How does design and technology account for all bodies and abilities? How do we address the uniqueness of everybody in our designs? And what is the role of empathy in design for celebrating our differences? So to start this series of presentations, I want to invite our first presenter, Alexa. She is a landscape architect at Laurie Olin's office in Philadelphia, I believe, and she will be presenting her research on deafscapes. Thank you, Alexa. Alexa, you're still muted.
Oh, I just muted.
Yep, can you restart?
Sorry. Hello, everyone. So yeah, I'm Alexa. I'm actually a deaf landscape designer and access specialist. And so I'm currently still with Olin in Los Angeles, but I'm starting a new position with MIG, or more Icofano and Goldsman, in the next few weeks. And so recently my work has focused on designing with the disabled community by including disabled stakeholders and experts directly. And today I'm going to run through a series I curated with the Landscape Architecture Foundation for their Landscape Performance Series website. And this focuses on public spaces where deafscape principles have been applied to build projects. And in these cases, it's actually unknowingly applied. So this series zooms in on 8 different projects from several different landscape architecture firms. And I can drop that link in YouTube later if anybody would like to look closer. But I'll be zooming in on these examples quickly with each corresponding deafscape principle. The series is based upon an article that I wrote in 2018 while a graduate student at UC Berkeley. And this is titled Deafscape, Applying Deaf Space to Landscape. And so as a deaf woman, I began to inquire about how we could apply Gallaudet University. That's the only deaf and hard of hearing university in the world. They have a series of deaf space principles that mostly focus on building interiors. But I began to think about, how can we apply these to the broader urban landscape, specifically the streetscape in this case. And so the goal is to create public spaces where deaf and hard of hearing people can flourish and experience joy far beyond the basic bare minimums of the ADA. And so the first principle is a texture transition. And this provides tactile and often visual cues between the sidewalk, planting areas, and also the street. And these can be felt with the feet while walking and having a conversation, or with a tactile cane. So this makes it particularly useful for blind and deafblind folks. An example is the material contrast along the edges of pathways at Barangaroo Reserve in Sydney, Australia. And this was designed by Peter Walker Partners, also known as PWP. The texture is subtle but tangible and serves as like a really beautiful cue for movement as well as safety. The second is the shoulder zone. And this is where people can step off of the main path of circulation to communicate, check phones, or just slow down and rest. A prominent and eclectic example are the deep shoulder zones at the Goods Line, which is also in Sydney, Australia, and this was designed by Aspect Studios. So these create deep areas off of the main path and provide a wide variety of choices of seating and other furnishings, and so it removes obstacles from the pathway. The third is the degree of enclosure, and this is one of my personal favorites because it helps me to feel safe from the back. So deaf folks and hard of hearing folks as well are very reliant on sight and 360-degree sensory reach to understand what's going on. So, if someone comes up from the back out of my sight lines, it really startles me if I don't see them. And a good example is really high-backed wooden benches at Chicago Riverwalk, and this was designed by Sasaki in Chicago, Illinois. These allow people to sit and view the river and passersby, but also provide the desired security at the back. The fourth is night lighting, and this is often common sense, but it's so necessary for safety and visibility, again, due to reliance on sight for communication between deaf and hard of hearing people. So if we can't see clearly, we are very unlikely to use this space at night. And it's also really important not to have too much glare, which can cause discomfort and eye strain if there's too much of it. So a good example of night lighting is the pavilions at Railroad Park in Birmingham, Alabama. And this was designed by Tom Leader's studio. These provide a good amount of light, which improves vision at night, but it's also soft and warm enough to prevent really bad glare. And so this creates spaces for people to safely and comfortably congregate in the evening. The next is flexible seating, which helps accommodate conversation more easily. In order to keep the line of sight between people communicating, there's room to move around and to adjust, and wheelchairs could also roll up to flexible seating tables. So furnishings should be really durable though, and made with good materials, obviously, so that they last a long time. An example of flexible seating, tables and chairs, incorporated into the design for Simon and Helen Director Park in Portland, Oregon, and this was designed by the firm I work for, Olin. And these furnishings can be artfully arranged for the individual comfort of park users and for a multitude of programming needs. The sixth is a wider pathway. And so this comes up often in my conversations with other disabled folks, not just the deaf community. And so I recommend a bare minimum of 10 feet on busy public sidewalks. And usually 6 to 8 feet can often work on less trafficked areas. But providing space to move is really important for deaf folks to communicate while walking through space, and also just for general comfort. So especially since there are so many delivery people, cyclists, and scooters these days, it's really important to make that space count. A good example of a really wide pathway, which stretches to about 17 feet wide in some places, is at Pompano Beach Boulevard in Florida. And so this was designed by EDSA. And this is actually wide enough to provide enough space for pedestrians, joggers, and even cyclists. And so there are also a lot of benches set off of the sidewalk to rest. So that kind of helps to avoid extra obstructions on the pathway. The next is rhythm. This creates a visual pattern along sidewalk edges, and this really helps us to move along and serves as a type of wayfinding, particularly in the peripheral vision while you're moving and communicating with other people. And so a good example of really colorful and eclectic rhythm is at Wilmington Waterfront Park in Los Angeles, and this was designed by Sasaki. And there are red sculptural light posts, and these provide stimulating movement through the site and can also ease navigation. And so the final DeafScape principle is a visual cue. And I touched on this briefly because it can take many forms, but the most important places to have visual cues are at pedestrian crossings. And so this can include flashing light fixtures, painted street lines, also contrasting sidewalk colors, bump outs at curbs. And these bump outs really help to increase pedestrian visibility and safety alongside cars and heavy traffic. So a really good example of a visual cue and wide bump out crosswalks is at Peace Street Corridor. And this is in Lincoln, Nebraska, designed by Design Workshop. And so it reclaims pedestrian space, and it also increases visibility. And you can see they've also included some, colorful plantings, contrasting colors, and also furnishings throughout for comfort and for rest. So thank you very much for having me today, and I'm looking forward to a discussion after the other slides are shown.
Great, thank you for your presentation, Alexa. It's really important to think about landscape design as well as buildings and other architectural design, and how we can really provide more ways and more visual cues for the deaf community. So really nice. Our next presenter to just move on is going to be Ava. She is in London right now, I believe, right? You're at the Bartlett University, and she does a lot of work with the body, but also with technology. And so please welcome Ava.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Virginia. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, great. So I like to start my presentation today with a slide from a short film titled In My Language by artist and activist Mel Baggs, who was a non-speaking person. And in this film, they spend the first half of the film actually documenting their techniques and methods of relating to the environment, and a series of, again, mechanisms and techniques that they've developed throughout the years that they use to understand and perceive the form and the texture and the location and distance of objects. And the second half of this film is dedicated to what they refer to as a translation of this language to something which is more relatable and understandable by what is generally labeled as able bodies. So when I watched this film a couple of years ago, it was at the very beginning of my research on multimodal perception and different methods that our bodies can engage with the environment and perceive our surrounding environment. And just watching Mel engage in all these activities and just fully embrace their multifaceted, multimodal experience of the environment was extremely fascinating for me. But I think the most striking moment in that film is when Mel states that the failure to learn your language, as in the language that able bodies use to relate to the environment, is seen as a deficit, but failure to learn Mel's language is seen so natural. And that really hit home for me because it was just right after I moved to the UK for my studies. And I was in this moment of transition from using my mother tongue, Farsi, to using English as the main channel of communicating with others and articulating my thoughts and emotions and imagination, and how in many situations I was finding myself lesser able or even disabled to do so, or even fully understand what was being addressed at me. So that parallel between my experience with language and Mel's experience with their language really made me think about what are the boundaries, or where is that line which define the conditions of disability or ability. And in no way I'm trying to flatten my experience with Mel and say that it was as challenging as Mel's experience. I also have to acknowledge my privileges compared to other immigrants. But again, I think there was something at the core of our experiences which were very common and similar, but obviously in many other ways different. So I started to look into it, and I realized that there isn't any scientifically proven or systematically explored set of criteria which define these conditions. It's just a series of standards which are vaguely defined. And it comes with no surprise that they're all based on a European cis male body and their experience of the world. And it was in that moment that I realized it wasn't really about standards. It was just about what was known and what was normal to a small community of people. and because of the colonial histories that we've lived through, that has implemented in our even modern way of thinking about standards. For example, the idea of the Vitruvian Man as a principle, which has been implemented in the way that we think about body standards, even in construction, architectural design, even dance notation, till this day. And I decided that I wanted to challenge this. I wanted to challenge why the known by a community of people had to become universal standards for example, design. And it wasn't just what was standard or what wasn't standard. It was about the privileges that these standard bodies and experiences are granted. For example, thinking about accessibility, functionality, and even human rights, they all revolve the standards. So I started my research and I realized that I obviously wasn't the only person who was interested in this. The Cyborg Manifesto, the Xenofeminist Manifesto, and the work of many other artists and designers were dealing with the same questions and, in a way, dilemmas. And interestingly enough, at the center of many of these explorations, technology was holding a very critical role as a powerful tool that could manipulate and challenge the known and the standard. So I started my explorations with technology, and I wanted to put technology in a very intimate relationship with the body of my users to instantly challenge some of these known body images, some of these known ways of relating to the environment. Again, going back to Mel's methods, what might be newer ways or more innovative ways, or even multimodal ways of relating to our environments. But parallel to that, I was also thinking about my users and how at the center of many artistic design research explorations, again, European cis male bodies and experiences were located, and how I wanted to just, by positioning certain marginalized identities or neglected bodies, again, question that dynamic and question our relationship with the unknown. And in the process, I realized the importance of the images that I was producing, because it was making people uncomfortable, but at the same time eager to know more, to understand the unknown better. And a series of things which were coming up. One of them was location and our relationship, and the fact that certain bodies are not really taking up much space in certain environments, in media, and so on. That became, again, something that I wanted to explore. I think a good example of what I'm trying to refer to can be Bridgerton, a Netflix series that just by positioning a woman of color in certain environments or clothing actually makes us realize how used to certain imagery and certain standards we are. So throughout my explorations, I've realized that our relationship with the standard and even the definition of the standards are very much more flexible than we think so. Obviously, throughout the years, they've become solidified, but we obviously have the opportunity to challenge them. And I think for me, that has manifested in the way that I work with soft materials and soft interfaces, because I like to, again, address that uniqueness of all of our experiences, and therefore create interfaces which could be worn by any and everybody. And yeah, I guess that is me. Just finishing with this slide from again, Mel's film. I just want to state that just because we don't fit what we think is a series of solid, rigid standards, that does not mean that we are a lesser of person and our thoughts and emotions are lesser valid. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ava. It is really important to address, like, what is a standard body and what is a non-standard body, because everything seems so flexible, and we don't, the standards are built on such old traditions that are really out of date at this time. And so we really need to question that. So next, just to continue with our presentations, we have Rachel. Rachel is at UNC Charlotte, and she works a lot with different technology, but also dealing with emotions and space. And so let's hear from Rachel.
Thank you. Let's see here. Okay, so I've titled this short talk for today, Disabling Phenomenology. It's a title taken from Josh Boyes, suggesting that disability and ability are an assemblage and not distinct concepts and experience-related design. So as was mentioned earlier, the body has played a pivotal role as a scalar instrument, metaphorical device, and perceptive tool in both the discourse and discipline of architecture. However, if we interrogate these domains and look more critically, for instance, at the Vitruvian man on the left, we see the ideal human figure as male, robbed of his clothing and forcefully transcribed into a circle and square. In all three cases, Palladio and Corbusier, and in this scenario, we see bodies as objects, looking at the body from the outside, often robbed of life and becoming an inert thing without will. Alternatively, if we look at bodies as subjects, as Karen Frank references, bodies are alive, sensing, feeling, moving, and acting with intention. So if we were to break away from assuming that the subjects of architecture are so-called normal, unencumbered, mobile, independent subjects who have archetypal responses to space, we might work to explore localized phenomenology rather than universalized approaches. And in this regard, I'd like to show a few projects that begin to disorient experience-related design in a series of different ways. And so I've kind of framed the projects around these two questions. The first being, where do bodies begin and end? This project was a response to COVID-19 distancing measures. It was a temporary installation exploring new privacy and the space around the body, which is claimed. It was titled COVID Confessionals, and it was engaging physically distanced bodies that are still socially engaged. It does so with a collection of room-size face shields based on 6-foot distancing measures and provides a way for people to come together safely in public space. It looks at architecture as a prosthesis through rapid response and ready-made assemblies, also exploring ideas of caustics with fields of light bouncing off curved dichroic protective surfaces in public space. So important to the project, I think there was an awareness of the mental consequences of social distancing, and it tries to provide a safe place for people to engage with one another, colorfully reminding us of our capacities for resilience. In this next project, under the question of where do bodies begin and end, it's also asking how do we delineate the spaces around them. So what is the relationship specifically between sound, body, and space? It defines space through non-visual sensations, through the design of subtle acoustical variations in the environment, whereby acoustic perception doesn't take place just through the ears, but through the entire body, and each part of the body can hear differently. It draws from Bernard Leacher's work, which speaks of corporeal hearing. He says, I can hear with my knee better than with my calves. It suggests that hearing shouldn't be equated with a sense organ of ear, since our entire body is exposed to sound waves. It does so through collaborative efforts with a sound designer in order to compose various multi-channel compositions played from different channeled speakers embedded in key geometrically altering sound panels. Sound then plays at various levels and heights in the pavilion to define space in and around it. So studying frequencies, volumes, movements, and combinations of sounds and their impact on the body, sound creates space in which the viewer must enter. So this is similar to the way we might think of Gothic cathedrals, and that sound is reflected from vaulted ceilings. The pavilion manipulates sound through surface diffusion with its texture and the preservation and intensification of sound from form-based reflection. So the visitor's entire body is exposed to sound waves. Sound boundaries not only move around them in all directions, but also pass right through their bodies. It avoids a purely building science or physics understanding of acoustics in favor of investigating sound qualities and their relationship to the perception of space. It recognizes that the subjective impressions of the visitor are just as important as the knowledge of any physically measurable parameters. It's exploring how the relationship between sound, space, and body can drive a conceptual agenda for a project by articulating the conditions of spatial experience through the design of architectural surfaces. So where do bodies begin and end? We could say that bodies at times include the space around us, and also at times they include our technological extensions. If we carry our cell phone with us every day, or if we wear a hearing aid, technology has become an extension of the body. This is why when you forget your cell phone at home, you psychologically feel like you've lost a part of yourself. So the cyborg here arises as a relationship to culture and society. If we look at it in pop culture, there's a fundamental argument that the cyborg is male, suggesting male is best suited for representing ideal or superhuman. However, Donna Haraway alternatively uses the cyborg to challenge dualisms of female and male, artifice and nature. She suggests that the cyborg may become so extreme that it loses sexual characterization and generates an androgynous character. The cyborg also challenges other kind of societal ideas and race characterizations. So technological prosthesis is a way of not just replacing what is natural that might be lost, but at times improving our capacities. So the last question I'm asking here with this work is whose bodies or whose experiences? This project was a family of furniture that is a design-focused trauma intervention that draws from what the body naturally does in its traumatic condition, explores the possibilities of using technology to mediate psychological and physiological states and spaces for therapeutic and otherwise beneficial ends. It does so by looking at the positive calming effects of conscious breathing and synchronized breathing. It attempts to help after trauma and draws from existing practices and theories that look at the body as a way to influence the mind. And it attempts to provide an opportunity to feel, experience, notice, and then begin to interact with one's body and physical sensations in an agentic and possibly self-soothing way. So it questions, how can we open the door for design, exploration of human suffering and aid in the healing process? The method involves the development of prototypes that explore various actuators and materials, dealing with inflation and deflation or rocking patterns, all that correspond to inhaling and exhaling inputs. So in her book, The Chair, Galen Kranz writes, we spend much of our waking lives in a chair. We touch chairs not just with our hands, but with our whole bodies. Yet despite their intimate place in our lives, we know little about them and their effects on us physically and mentally. Without a doubt, their efforts are profound. What is true of the chair is true of all artifacts we create. We design them, but once built, they shape us. So likewise, these experiments draw on the notion of empathy. In this last scenario, the furniture takes in two users, one person controlling the inflating of the chair with their breath while the other experiences their reaction. These studies question how design and technology might play a role in encouraging empathy and enhance shared relationships between people through conscious and synchronized breathing. So those experiments later informed the design of a large-scale responsive environment titled Air Hugs. The environment is made up of a set of inflatable lungs which fill with air and encase and enclose the space around the body, offering a deliberate, delicate, and gracious hug. I just have a really quick video of this. So the installation is a responsive environment that receives, tracks, and moves with the passerby, causing the actuated material to produce a calculated gentle breathing, contractions of rustling sounds, and fields of reflection and light. Reasonable yet absurd, the title draws from the use of air as a material, and the hug, which offers an immediate awareness of one's body and of other bodies, and of the space between or lack thereof, recalibrating human scale and enhancing social interactions. Combined, air and hugs offers an otherness, which excites our present temporal existence and moves beyond the rigidity that most often structure our built environments. The exhibition lines the gallery unapologetically with softness, much like the lining of architecture with the hanging of curtains, placement of carpets, wrapping of foams around furniture in order to modify a local environment. It does not simply stand still in empty space, but instead fills it with potential, reaching and gesturing outward, yearning for reciprocation. Nicholas Negroponte describes similar ideas, promoting humanism through intelligent machines. And he writes about the desire to conjure a world where buildings are animate, thinking, and emotive beings, which actively house and protect us physically as well as psychologically. The Air Hugs installation asks, how might design and technology provide us with newfound intimacy with ourselves, each other, and the world around us? And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that amazing presentation. I think one of the things that's really great is that it's not just about individual bodies, but also how we work together and how we respond to one another in an environment, and these kind of apparatus that can help us exaggerate or enhance those experiences. So really great. Let's move on to our next presenter, Sean Alquist, from the University of Michigan, where he's been working with installations that deal with play and engagement. So welcome, Sean.
Hello, hi. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really amazing to be in a room talking about these topics. It's often what everybody's presented so far are topics that I often try to speak to, but in a room where, whoops, uh-oh, my Zoom. Guess my Zoom crashed. Can everybody still see me?
We can still see you and hear you. So
okay, it said my Zoom crashed, but I guess we're still going. Okay. So, anyways, what everybody's been talking about, these are things I always try to talk about in a room full of architects, and everybody gives me strange looks and just can't comprehend what what the heck it is we're trying the message we're trying to communicate. So so honestly, it'd be great to have a conversation with everybody right after this. Based on what's been discussed, I actually kind of reshuffled some of my slides to try and put some names to things and also, you know, show how I've been trying to talk about and research and explore this relationship between the body, the mind, and environment, and really the position of a designer within that. So I kind of frame it as like orchidness and autonomy, which maybe are a little bit kind of conflicting. So I'll kind of talk through this a little bit through the slides. So this stems from the experiences with my daughter, who has autism. She's age 12 now. And the particular thing to recognize with her situation in the environment is she's nonverbal. So I think this was spoken to in the first presentation, or sorry, the second presentation. And it really brings forward this recognition that environment is a key necessity to her communication. And it really becomes this amazing creativity that she exudes because she really has to turn environment, the things in her environment, the people in her environment, the actions in her environment, into, you know, if you want to call it words, but into forms of communication to let you know what's working, what's not working, what she's interested in, the kind of particularities of that environment that help her thrive, that help her become creative, that help her express her personality. It happens in ways that are very foreign to our own understanding. So just as a kind of quick story, where I'm actually in Colorado right now because our daughter is at a camp called Ascendigo, which is designed for children and adults, children, teens, and adults with autism. And we're just talking to one of the people that run the kind of the more outdoor activities that they do, whether it's horse riding, water sports, climbing, stuff like that. And he was talking about how parents would come to him and say, "Oh, it's so awesome that you're, you know, able to work with our child for the whole day, for the whole week, you know, for the whole camp." And he just kind of looks at him and is like, "You know, okay, your child's wonderful. Like, what? I don't understand. What's the problem?" And they would explain that they would go to these other therapeutic programs, and the second any kind of behavior would come up, they would kick them out. And the response of this you know, kind of therapist, you know, trainer, teacher, partner was just, you know, "Oh, but your child doesn't really have any, you know, significant behaviors or anything like that." So it's really, you know, it's kind of eye-opening, not surprising, but eye-opening in terms of, you know, how this kind of social construct of what works and what doesn't work plays into, you know, defining someone's ability as well. And that's something that we very much try to explore in the work. So just a quick background on the work itself. So I'm a professor at Michigan, as Virginia mentioned, and really a kind of key medium which we explore is the textile. In my lab, we have 2 industrial knitting machines. We have access to a yarn twisting machine. So we really use this advantage to build the textile from, you know, the ground up and kind of create it for the experience to foster very tactile interactions, but also create environments that, as what was mentioned with Negroponte's kind of soft architecture, the ability to you know, transform space, the ability that the body can transform space, the mind, the interest, the tactile interest, the sensory needs, the sensory fascination, all of these actually transform environment and have a kind of constant sort of back and forth. And our ability to curate the textile towards that is really valuable in that research. So, you know, we look at kind of creating environments that sort of integrate and intertwine the visuals through interactive projections, shown the kind of tactile, whether it's the scale of the skin or the body. My daughter likes to do kind of a face plant into these and literally, like at the scale of her mouth, sort of feel the fibers like pushing against her. And, you know, like I said, at the scale of the body, and the idea that, you know, there is an abstractness to these forms so that someone can walk up to it and wonder for themselves, you know, what is this for? I also talk about the kind of like challenge of fixed architecture, like the slide on the playground. You can pretty much use it one way and one way only. And when someone like my daughter, who sees the environment from a completely different perspective, wants to use it a different way, that's really not accepted. So it becomes a very exclusionary object. So the idea here is really the point of entry is creativity. So the point of entry is, you know, your own idea of how you might functionalize this piece of architecture or this object. And just having always a kind of dynamic nature to it. So that there isn't a kind of fixation to a particular moment. There's, a kind of constant transitioning that's happening in terms of, what this environment actually is. And then to really draw in that tactile interest, creating these as interactive surfaces where it actually senses touch of the hand and the body. So you can see sort of, the visuals interacting with the movement of the hand on the textile surface. So what we've kind of come to in that research and where we're looking to next is to try and understand, what is architecture's role? What is the designer's role? What is the participant's role in creating and experiencing space? So we've sort of looked at it at maybe these three different capacities. So as a way to help foster social interaction, especially for children with autism, where across the board that can be pretty challenging. So if you create this sensory-rich environment, is it only within that really sensory responsive, that kind of rich, tactile, visual, proprioceptive, vestibular environment? Is it only within that moment where those sensations are triggered that a confidence is gained and autonomy and independence is gained to be able to tackle social interaction, to foster social interaction? Or is there sort of a radiant effect? Is there a kind of time-based effect, which we've seen a little bit of evidence of, where a child who interacts within one of these spaces and kind of satisfies that sensory curiosity, going back into a classroom, which is down.
Sean, I think we seem to have lost your microphone. Oh, there we go.
Okay, I think everyone can hear me again.
Yes, we can hear you again. Thank you.
Okay, the challenges of being on holiday and technology. The idea with the radiant, we actually saw that there was a child who performed much better in his classroom, based on evidence from his teacher, where he was much more focused. It's basically like a sort of itch was scratched. He was sort of more calm, more focused. And instead of, losing interest in his kind of classroom task after 5 minutes, he could kind of sit there for 10 or 12 minutes and focus, which is a pretty big gain. And then the last one is really more this distributed idea. Are there kind of like moments of this sensory interaction that can be just embedded in a more normative and architecture that allows the kind of, satisfaction of that sensory interaction, and enables the kind of synchronous overcoming of the kind of discord with the normative environment. So it's maybe more a constant kind of sampling of sensory interaction than it is a kind of immersion within it. And then the last thing I want to talk about, actually I'll kind of skip over that. So this kind of just the range of collaborators that happens with the work. And then, again, this idea of how environment becomes a tool for communication. So here, my daughter turned the suitcase into this tool where we could help foster communication, whether that's, interaction just in terms of eye gaze, or she would point, because actually it was more that she wanted to roll around inside the suitcase than it was just sit inside of it. So it helped us develop language for stop, go, pointing left and right, and things like that. So it's really, and again, I think this is the one thing that gets lost, is this concept of creativity, that there's an inherent kind of aspect to being creative when you're somebody whose abilities don't fit with your environment. But I think often architecture doesn't allow that creativity to thrive. It tries to almost sort of like negate it and solve for it, as opposed to just let it happen. And it is kind of a double-edged sword. All the people that I work with, they say like tinkering is a part of their life. Nothing fits for them, even if it's designed for them. But that tinkering means that they have the ability to make it suit them. But at other times they get pretty tired with having to constantly fix everything, essentially, to make it work. To look at this relationship between environment and communication particularly, there's this amazing video that Disney did called Loop. It's a short film. Unfortunately, you need Disney Plus to watch it, but it's pretty, I mean, it has its pluses and minuses, but I think if you look at it from this lens of how environment plays a role in this girl's ability to communicate with this other peer, I think it starts to shed light on how, again, how the moments that it doesn't work, but then the moments that it does work, and the patience involved in discovering a shared language, a shared multimodal language. So I'll kind of skip through this because I'm sort of running long, but so this last part was just from a collaboration that's been ongoing. It's with an organization called the Center for Independent Living. We work with the facility in Ann Arbor. It's a federally and state funded program, so all states have these facilities, and their task is to provide support for people who want to get into employment, who want to live independently, whether that's, in their own kind of household. So they provide all these services, and we've been working with them in how to design spaces that help facilitate all of these things. So the one key factor which we didn't realize was going to take a lot of time to develop was we actually had students embedded with people who work at the Center for Independent Living to help develop designs. And the amount of time needed to really build a personal relationship and find a moment where they could start to communicate about design, that actually took a lot longer than what we thought. We almost didn't think that was really a necessary part of it. But each team, who is basically 2 Michigan students and 1 person from the CIL, each team really needed several weeks and several Zoom meetings to just become familiar with each other and comfortable with each other and comfortable with a way about talking about each other, to then they could finally kind of, engage in design discussions. And we had a Miro board, which kind of, shared thoughts. And one person whose name is Gwyneth, she was really amazing at challenging the students and putting in some pretty poignant questions about, what is empathy? What does empathy mean in this situation? What are the sort of wrong versions of empathy that don't work? And then what is maybe the right way to execute empathy within a design context? So they came up with this idea of the chair, which I think it was Rachel talked about in quite depth. So one of the students came up with this concept of a knit that essentially wraps around the chair. And what was interesting was to really define architecture only at the moment that the body was wrapped within the chair. And it really became, instead of saying that this was kind of an answer to some sort of exploration of ranges of ability, it really became more of a conceptual expression of those who are abled and those who are disabled and those that are non-disabled. And also explored the kind of relationship or the social kind of connection in terms of occupying this space. There was a very interesting moment that one of the participants mentioned that, in this interaction, it was quite interesting to feel the bodies, pushing and pulling on each other. In another interaction where they're facing each other, the person said, like, that form of social interaction was too confrontational. She's like, looking through one of these tubes and seeing one face versus another face right at you it just was completely uncomfortable. You're kind of in this own space that your body has literally formed. There's no other way but your body to form that space. And then all of a sudden you're confronted with this other space. It becomes really invasive. So in that way, the experience was quite, explorational and explained quite a bit in terms of this relationship of environment, social interaction, ability, and how architecture is formed through levels of ability and interest. So as opposed to saying like, this status, this becomes a tool for somebody who has a disability, it really becomes more of an awareness concept in experience than it does like, a particular tool. So, so we'll actually be exploring this further in some exhibitions over the coming year. So I think I'll end there. I kind of wandered through a few different projects, but hopefully kind of touched upon what everybody had been talking about.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Sean. Wonderful as always. And I think the breadth of the work and the ways that you're approaching things are really unique. So for our final presentation, we have Jonathan Duckworth. He couldn't be here today because it's probably about 2 a.m. or so in Australia, but he has sent a video that I'm going to play. And this is our last presentation. So after this video, we will begin to start to discuss. So let's watch this video.
Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Duckworth. I'm an associate professor in the digital media program in the School of Design at RMIT Melbourne, Australia, where I direct the Creative Interventions Art and Rehabilitative Technology Research Lab, or SciArt for short. It's a pleasure to be presenting at the Inclusive Futures event today. Sorry I can't join you online today, but I have prepared a short recorded presentation of my work. In my presentation, Interactive Arts and Design for Inclusive Participation, I'll discuss a research project called EDNA, designed for motor and cognitive rehabilitation for individuals with brain injury. And I'll discuss the way this project has grown beyond its original clinical use into the arts community for individuals with a disability. So EDNA is a set of interactive game-like applications designed for movement rehabilitation for individuals with a brain injury, such as stroke or traumatic brain injury. The activities include environments that encourage collaboration, challenge, and creative modes of user interaction designed to engage patients in rehabilitation. The technology combines a digital tabletop touchscreen monitor, tangible user interfaces, and interactive, playful environments. And participants use the handheld objects to play a variety of games, compose with sound, and create animated artwork. Actions that are simple in form and playful in effect, but they're better accommodating the physical and cognitive limitations of many of our participants. So stroke is one of the most common forms of acquired brain injury and currently affects 500,000 Australians. It often results in impaired hand and reach function, making it a leading cause of disability. The long-term effects of brain injury are difficult to predict, and symptoms are different for each person. The general repercussion cycle shown on this slide shows what can typically happen to a person after a brain injury. The cycle starts with a trauma, which leads to a variety of physical, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral deficits. And these problems interact and can combine to create psychosocial problems, which can create completely new problems. So brain-injured patients experience, generally, difficulty to perform activities of daily living and self-care. Our team took a research approach that spans across design, arts, and science domains to tackle the complexity for designing for brain injury. We explored a range of guiding philosophies to help direct the design and research. To design the iterations of our system, we utilized concepts from embodied interaction design, a theory developed by human-computer interaction designer Paul Durish. An embodied interaction provides a design framework that focuses on a first-person lived body experience and its relation to the environment. Durish's perspective attempts to unify the physical affordances of the world and computer worlds through a design approach that relates to developing user interfaces that really closely match our everyday experiences and abilities. So in short, designing user interfaces and user interaction that is more natural, tangible, and intuitive to use. Taking on board some of the concepts of embodied interaction and embodied cognition, our design process led to 6 goals that envisaged the design of a possible preferred state and guided our design prototypes, which was accompanied by testing and reflection with patients. So we wanted to create an interactive artwork for movement rehab that provides opportunities for creativity and play. We wanted to create environments that engage and motivate the patients in their therapy. We wanted to also design a physical user workspace that enables a more sort of direct, non-invasive form of interaction. We didn't want to tether the patients to any form of wearable sensors, as we saw this as a potentially distracting and unwelcome. We wanted to develop the user interfaces in a way that capitalize on our sort of natural physical abilities and how we manipulate objects in the real world. We also wanted to track movement and recording of the interactions for later review by the patient. And finally, the ease of operation for both the patient and the therapist. So I'd just like to show one example of one of the environments that we've created, which is a collaborative music tool. So a number of colored lines emanate on a central axis from the base of each of the objects when placed on the display. And these lines visually sort of subdivide the screen into colored polygonal fragments that produce an audiovisual note when touched. And additional fragments are created as more objects are placed on the display, enabling a larger range of notes to be played. So single touch and multi-touch gestures generate softer and louder sounds respectively, and sliding the objects across the display changes the size of the fragments. The pitch and note changes based on the fragment's position on the screen, and very simple actions are awarded by complexity and richness. In 2014, our work took an unexpected turn when we took the system out of the clinical environment and presented the work in the public domain. A partnership formed between RMIT, Jolt Sonic and Visual Arts, and the Footscray Community Arts Centre in Melbourne to customise this application for the Amplified Elephants, an ensemble of sound artists with intellectual disability. This collaboration resulted in several public performances using the interface. And in developing their performances, the Amplified Elephants were mentored by established professional sound artist and composer James Hullock in 4-hour sort of weekly workshops at the community centre, held over 3 months. And the artists used the device as the central feature to structure their improvisational processes. Based on the positive feedback from the festival performances, we wanted to expose the technology to a wider audience. And in 2016, we adapted the device for James Hullock to perform in a concert with 4 percussionists in a new work called Resonance on the Dome, which was presented at RMIT Design Hub Gallery. The performance was displayed in a dome projection, an ultra-high resolution 4K projection, 6-meter wide immersive hemispherical display, which was suspended over the audience. And through this process of engagement across many different communities and research domains, we've been able to refine and adapt the system to different contexts. The system has extended well beyond its original design from clinical rehabilitation use towards an instrument for musicians with disability and professional performers. And that can be networked as a controller to manipulate large multi-projector displays. And as such, the original design has become entangled across sort of multiple domains and disciplines. So some concluding thoughts. We found that sort of multidisciplinary collaborative approaches to a multifaceted problem like rehabilitation is essential. And specific to design, people need their interactions with technologies to be simple, intuitive, and pleasurable. And these types of research collaborations should be open to different approaches, tolerate failure, and embrace risk. We found that design and science together can contribute new research insights that neither could do alone. Design and creativity with stakeholders of all different abilities offer opportunities to simplify and humanize technology and develop emotionally resonant products. In our research, there was a complex arrangement of stakeholders. We found that the project gained acceptance through multiple avenues of user engagement. In our case, it was from clinic to community arts, it was exhibited, and it was performed. And with each outcome, the system was iteratively improved. Inclusive technology design in the arts may further enhance the opportunities and developmental needs of people, for people with a disability. And it acts as a catalyst that extends the invitation to participate in cultural activities, a sense of belonging to a group, and the development of specific competencies that can be carried forward. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to hearing how the event goes. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all of our presenters, even Jonathan, although he could not be here today physically. That was a wonderful video that he submitted for us to watch. And I think leaving us off with that kind of discussion, one of the things that comes to my mind that I see as such an overlap in all of the presentations is obviously this idea of sensory relationship to our built environment, but also play. I see a lot to deal with how our environment isn't this stationary, stagnant thing, but that we as humans want to play with it and engage with it in very interesting ways. And I suppose, Alexa, because you presented first and you were presenting on landscape, so it's a little less about these smaller devices, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on play in the environment as well, and how landscape designs can be more playful for people with different abilities.
Sure. So I haven't worked too much on playscapes, so to speak. I've focused a little bit more on the adult side of the design spectrum, I guess. But I think that as far as creating really interactive environments, it really comes down to including the community that you're designing for in the process. And so that was something that I've really focused on with the recent fellowship that I had. And maybe we can drop the link to my website in the YouTube box. But I think that really what I've learned is just like, no matter what age group you're designing for, whether it's the disabled community you're focusing on, it's really important to include those people that you're designing for directly in the process. And so, when we begin to talk about the disabled community in particular, a lot of the time this community is left off of the table when we discuss design. And so I think, taking the extra effort and initiative to make sure that we're bringing like a very diverse group of disabled community members to the table, to the whole design process from beginning to end, and even afterwards, testing success of our designs is really important, because oftentimes I think we have this assumption that like, oh, we are considering everybody, but we aren't really unless we're talking to the people and having them test everything out. And so, yeah, I just think that's probably the most important piece of advice I would give as far as thinking about different sensory needs, different sensory experiences, because obviously as a deaf person, I can't describe every single disabled person's preferences, right? So everybody's preferences are going to vary widely from person to person. So.
Yeah, I totally understand that the diversity of experiences is so broad, right? And how do we begin to gain that empathy for all these different types of experience is really important to continue to learn from each other and also bring more awareness with when we're working on a design project. And whether it is engaging these people during the design process, but also I think some of the times what I see in Sean's work is there's a lot of unexpected things that you learn from and build on from project to project, right? And so how do you continue it as a larger body of work rather than, okay, I did that project, I finished it, but how do you continue to learn and build is really important. Are there any?
Can I jump in on that? So So one thing that I'm always trying to challenge is like the ego of the architect. And this comes up in a lot of conversations. I was a part of a conversation at Lincoln Center in New York it's called the Big Umbrella Festival, where they brought together more the kind of arts and theater community for these groups that had developed, inclusive and theater experiences and productions. And their concept was largely like, that the children are on stage with the actors, it's really a kind of actor to child relationship within a larger story. And the first thing they talked about is losing the ego of the actor, where it was quite surprising. I mean, it's like, you're really up on stage to show your art and, gain the applause from the audience. I was like, that's quite an ego there. And and I saw in the productions that they did, some of that diminished, but not really enough. Because again, my daughter wasn't quite fitting in, and there were some moments that she wanted to explore. And they're like, no, we want to sit here, sit in your nice, comfortable, cushy, sensory chair and just kind of watch as we move around you. And I was like, yeah, you're not quite getting the picture. Like, you still want to deliver your art, and you're just doing it in a slightly more patient way, but really not quite enough. So, to me, to talk to it more distinctly, it's really the fact that like the architect, the designers, got to let go of the ego that they would ever be able to design for the, encompassment, the entire envelope of what you're talking about, of what Alexa was talking about. So how do you cede design power? How do you let go of design power to somebody else? It's a challenging concept, and I think we're still, trying different frameworks in which design happens by somebody else, and what is that form of design where you don't want to just call it the user, and a form of design where we want to learn. Like, I mean, again, my daughter is this amazing creative voice. But we need to create the right venue for that, right? I mean, inclusion isn't just like getting somebody to the table, getting a voice to the table. It's really about allowing that voice to express itself. And I think that's often where architects kind of fail, is that second step. They might think like kind of getting that voice at the table is as far as they need to go. But it's really how do you let meaning from that participant arise and contribute. So not just sort of be present, but actually be a contributor to it. And it's a really hard question for sure. But like I said, I mean, all the work that everybody talked about here was bringing up those concepts that we're starting to let that happen. It's just, like I said, it's really hard to have these conversations at a table. I guess it's kind of one side of the fence or the other. People either understand it or they don't. And it's hard to get those that don't to the other side of the fence.
I think also, could I respond to that really quickly, Virginia? I think, Sean, like what you said about, I think it's interesting that you said, obviously bringing disabled folks to the table isn't enough. As far as like the work that I've been doing, I think that step isn't even being met right now, as far as like even bringing disabled people into the picture at all. And so that's something that has to happen. And then of course, giving those voices agency in the process is the next step. And I think that's important to note. And, we touched on the concept of the ego. And I think a lot of the time with designers and anybody that does any type of, art or building type related professions, the ego can become very paternalistic towards disabled people. And so I think that when we talk about empathy, it's really important to note that empathy is not about pity or, checking certain boxes. Like, it's about respect, mutual respect building, and letting people express themselves and letting people share their opinions on all sorts of topics that we're touching on. And so I think that Sean, is someone that I'm not sure if you identify as disabled yourself. I'm assuming no, but working with your daughter, I can kind of see that you kind of bring her agency to the table and you let her show you in the ways that she can, like what she wants. And so I can appreciate that, because I think that, when you're not disabled and you're designing with disabled people, or for disabled people rather, it's really important to be more of an advocate and to provide, a foundation of agency, more so than obviously letting the ego take control of everything. So I did want to take note of that, just the fact like empathy really needs to be more about, respect.
That's great. I mean, we had a lot of conversations around empathy and have trouble defining it appropriately. Because it's stereotypical definition. I honestly don't believe in it, because I think it is that kind of like, more sympathetic view, or, oh yeah, I can understand your perspective, and I'll never understand what it is to be autistic. I just never will. But my perspective is, I am a part of the community with my daughter, whether it's just the two of us, a community of two, or it's our family, or it's a community, within a larger public concept at the grocery store or something like that. So my advocacy is in my ability to enter the conversation is not to try and be her or even represent her voice, but represent the voice of somebody that is a part of her life, and her ability is defined by my ability. Her ability is defined by my ability to understand her, for us to communicate. So I kind of fight for that sort of larger picture of the kind of social construct of ability, as opposed to being the advocate, like just for her as an individual, or just for autism as a kind of cause.
I was just going to jump in here really quickly, because Gustavo was asking some interesting questions in the chat about, how we start to incorporate these things in design education and practice and so forth. And I was just going to mention an option studio that I taught that was titled Constraints and Concepts, where we actually started with sections of ADA code. And we also did a dining in the dark experience that was hosted by the Center for the Visually Impaired. And so I think all too often we save these things to the end of the project as a last consideration. And so instead of doing that, the studio was about how do we kind of hone in on certain conditions at the very beginning and use that as the primary driver for the project. And so what was interesting too is by participating in some of these more experiential things like the dining in the dark experience, the students were actually exposed in a lot of ways, not just to ideas of blindness, but after their experience of dining, we kind of talked about it, and they talked about how visual cues were completely removed, where you didn't know the age or race of who you were sitting next to either. And so I think what becomes really interesting is that when we start to incorporate these things into design education, all of a sudden, I think it starts to address a multiplicity of scenarios, sometimes beyond what we might even originally expect.
Yeah, Ava, you also had your hand up for a second there.
Yes, I just wanted, going back to the problem of the ego of the designer, I wanted to say that maybe a relationship with technology is also something which could be explored in relation to this question, because technology as it is defined is something that it's unknown, but it at the same time serves users' desires and goals. So it is a very, I think, interesting relationship and dynamic that we have with technology. And I think that level of ambiguity that technology carries allows users to come in and take actually what they want and what they need from it, which I think can be a very interesting way of thinking about designing. Just thinking about like social platforms and how they have been used by different generations throughout time for like a platform for, let's say, communication, and then as a point of like documentation, and now to how Generation Z is actually using it for a space for promoting like social and political action. I think, again, that is a very interesting dynamic, which I think can inspire a lot of like design thinking. And also going back to, I think it was Sean who talked about empathy. I wanted to address that because I think I hold a little different view. And I think if we understand the way that empathy actually works in the body and the mind, the way that the mirror neurons actually make us, in a way, have an embodied experience of what the other person or an other person is actually going through, that would lead, again, going back to, I think, what Jonathan mentioned, that leads to a shift in perspective and perception towards things. And again, that feeds back to how we act and how we react and how we behave. So I think maybe also there might be something in that cycle which could be interesting.
I guess I might jump in and maybe follow up also on just feedback from students having done courses and stuff like that, which reflects like what Rachel was saying, and even that challenge of, you know, defining empathy as well. Yeah, the students, I mean, they just quickly became frustrated with the fact that, yeah, it's always, you know, ADA for one is kind of, you know, the only thing that's discussed, and it's usually discussed as kind of an afterthought or a hindrance to the design process, and trying to get to, you know, turn that around was definitely quite challenging. And we had a quite interesting moment where there were a set of engineering students that wanted to link my seminar with their capstone course. So they needed to, you know, design something that had a very you know, had a mechanical concept to it. They were undergrad students working as a group to develop that capstone project. And they quickly outran the kind of level of knowledge and maturity in the area of disability and disability theory and respect and all this and design, their supervising professor. And we would just hear these horror stories, essentially, of how the professor was responding to their work. Like, oh, well, you know, because again, it was a team. So there were two engineers, one designer from architecture, and then one participant from the Center for Independent Living. And they were meant to be the design team. And the professor kept asking, like, well, what is that person's problem and how are you going to fix it? And it's like, how do you respond? And some of the people from the Center for Independent Living, they're like, you know, I was going to leave this course because that's so offensive. Like, if that's allowed to happen, then I don't even want to be a part of this conversation. So to some people, it like hit really hard. And, you know, to the students, they were, you know, they didn't know how to address a superior, essentially, in a way to kind of, you know, educate them, I guess, in a better way to talk about it. So, you know, so it's like, I mean, in a way, that's the perfect example of how empathy can be read and misread, and how ego kind of plays into it, and just how ignorance plays into all of that as well. So in that context of education, which I know Gustavo was asking questions about, you know, it's a challenge for the knowledge within a course that can be very focused and very successful on exposing this awareness. It's very difficult for that to, you know, kind of radiate beyond those boundaries.
I kind of wanted to jump back into the topic of the ADA and like how it's kind of treated as a total afterthought, because this is research that I touched on recently, and I was wondering if I could pull my screen up again really quickly because I have a little diagram that I made.
Sure.
But with my recent fellowship, I released a website called Design with Disabled People Now. And so basically one of the toolkits I really has this diagram here, and this is kind of how I've begun to treat the ADA as like the absolute quantitative bare minimum. And so basically what that means is, you're following standards as, the law, the legal factor in this equation. And then you can take universal design principles, which are really broad and ambiguous, and sort of treat them as like a creative tool. And then we bring in the qualitative control, which, is sort of like beyond our creative QA/QC, to bring in, disabled stakeholder feedback and also disabled experts feedback. And so this is sort of like how I'm starting to treat this process, because of course we have to follow the ADA, but going back to sort of like what that looks like, we still have these really like empty, vacant, like weird standard graphics, right, that don't really embody the disabled community as a whole. And so when I've studied the ADA, I've also noticed that, the deaf and hard of hearing community really isn't even considered in this set of standards. This is coming from, the standards for accessible design that we have to follow legally as architects and designers. And so that was sort of how my DeafScape work came about, because I realized that, I'm not even represented in this legal document. And this is what the disabled community has fought so hard for, to get implementation of these like accessibility standards to public space, right? But for me, they only touch on, I believe it was like visual flashing fire alarms within buildings, and then having like captions at really large stadium, like Jumbotron screens. And so really that's pretty much it as far as like my personal needs. They're not being discussed at all. And so when we look at universal design, these are just like the 7 principles. And Ronald Mace was actually a disabled architect and educator at North Carolina State. And so just kind of thinking about them, they're just so broad that we can really start to use them as a creative tool. So this is like the methodology. And I mean, I have a couple of examples here if we wanted to take a quick look. But I mean, one example was like a public pathway, for example, because this is one of the most important DeafScape principles that I touched on as well. Like having enough space to move is really important to like all members of the disabled community as well as non-disabled people. And so thinking about, like the bare minimum width for the ADA is only 36 inches. So that's literally like 3 feet. And you can pretty much only fit like 1 wheelchair in that scenario. Wouldn't be able to really communicate with anybody in that situation, because if you're thinking about like walking single file, can't see anybody behind me or in front of me, I have to crane my neck, right? And so with the person speaking with me. And so, if we take a creative tool from universal design, which, like the 7th principle, size and space for approach and use, we can think about like, what does this mean as far as like, how can we expand beyond the bare minimum of the ADA standards? And then with participation, we found, with the deaf community, 10 feet is usually like the bare minimum to have like a really comfortable space in public spaces. But, we might learn that maybe other disabled folks want even more space, like 15 feet. And so, yeah, this is just kind of illustrating what that looks like. Like the public pathway that I mentioned to you, 3 feet is really small. And then moving to 10 feet, and then moving into 15 feet, and different universal design principles and ideas can be applied. So I just think it's really important to think about the ADA as like, obviously we have to follow it, but it's not everything. Like it definitely has to be met as like the bare minimum, I think, of all of our design. So yeah, sorry, I could talk about this for days.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's really interesting too is a lot of the presentations started by discussing these standards, or what is a standard body, and how those perceptions are really out of date of like who is the standard human, and it's very like male oriented and out of date. But also, even I think when we look at ADA, the standard of what a disabled person is also extremely out of touch, because there's so much diversity in the types of disabilities and how every person relates to the environment, that when you look at this standard of like, here's a guy with a cane and here's a guy in a wheelchair, and that's all you get for how disabled people are, is really not touching on the diversity of the ways that we perceive and interact with our environment. And so I think it's really important to address all these different ways. And I think that's something that we're seeing in all the work from today is that there's so many ways that we can engage, whether it's vision or sound, tactility, and even with technology helping augment our ways of working with the environment. It's very interesting.
I'd love to jump in and reply to some of what Gustavo's been asking about, you know, how does this happen in design? So I actually think, I mean, like I said, I've been working with this group at the Center for Independent Living, and one thing that they do is they are a consulting resource to planners, and usually it's a bit more planning. So whether that's the architect that's doing the planning or it's the town board that's reviewing the planning, they do act as consultants to them to, you know, make sure to question whether they're meeting ADA. And I think one thing that we've started to learn in our collaboration, which is running about 2 years now, is the architect's, the, you know, educator, the student's ability to start to project new, more innovative ways in which design can address these questions that you're asking. So we're not directly facilitating the conversation with the planners about what else can they do, you know, with their designs, how can they be more expansively, universally designed. But our ideas maybe educate people at the CIL to just understand architect is more than, you know, pathways and benches and you know, ramps, and they should be challenged, you know, further. They can start to say, well, what if you question the materiality of these things? You know, as an architect, why aren't you thinking deeper about that and really push for innovation through that means? And our relationship has really tried to expose that, and even some of the things that we're doing into their facility. They're taking a conference room space and turning it into a gallery, and part of the exhibitions in the gallery are going to be, you know, some of these students' investigations into textiles, into concrete, into the other materials that we do through our Fab Lab and so on. So just the vision of these innovative uses of materials to people at the CIL who are very knowledgeable about their experience in life and all the regulations, hopefully that starts to kind of bleed through and disseminate through that angle. So it's a bit kind of circuitous route, I suppose. But just to kind of answer that question of like who needs to be or who potentially can be a part of the conversation to try and build this awareness, that's sort of one way we're kind of testing the waters and seeing if how we can, you know, disseminate more exploration and experimentation.
I just wanted to say I love that you're working directly with the CIL because I'm a UC Berkeley alum, and so you know, the first Center for Independent Living actually came up in Berkeley, and it was a direct response of, you know, the disability rights movement. They built that up from the ground, and so yeah, I definitely think the CIL is an awesome place to collaborate with. And you know, I get questions all the time about like, oh, how can I even find disabled people to bring to the table? And it's just kind of like, I mean, there are organizations and nonprofits out there that are doing this work, but it's also like individuals like me, so to speak, are everywhere. I mean, people don't realize that the disabled population is like 20 to 25% of the entire US population. It's a lot of people, 1 to 4 to 1 in 5. So I know we're spread out, but we're pretty much everywhere. So as far as like dissemination is concerned, like just send everything out and we'll find it.
I'd like to, we've been hearing a lot from Sean and Alexa. I don't know if Ava or Rachel, you have any thoughts that are burning, also responses to some of Gustavo's questions in the chat here about, you know, how we can encourage these initiatives. And I mean, one thing is I think that I'm really interested in how technology plays a role in this, because obviously, I think that both of you really use a lot of technological things to help augment these relationships between people. Rachel?
Yeah, I was just going to say that maybe just to tag on a little bit, ignoring the technology part for just a moment, but to tag on to some of what was said. I mean, it seems like in a lot of ways, it's our role as educators to kind of challenge preconceived ideas of the built world. And so I think, you know, that's one way in which we can see change maybe outside of all of the other kind of political domains that could be involved in this. I think students are actually really eager to want to see difference. I think that's what's maybe unique about this next generation that's coming up, is that, you know, they're interested in these types of questions and ideas and so forth. And so, you know, I think part of that too, as it flows into the discipline of architecture, has a lot to do with the way that we think about programming, and how programming oftentimes relates to like preconceived ideas of certain types of activity or the way bodies behave in space. And so I think if we, you know, as professionals can challenge the notion of programming in various ways, and maybe this kind of comes into the earlier questions related to play and activity, and you know, some of the work that we do too is more about kind of experimentation and really kind of activating the public domain to try to take things outside of the lab and actually practice them in public space and see, you know, what the responses are and so forth. And so I think maybe those are two different ways of looking at it, you know, one through education, the other through not just operating in a laboratory or a petri dish, but kind of moving outward and trying things in that domain.
I think going back to the role of technology, I think most of the problems that we might be mentioning during this conversation, for me, again, comes from our rigid relationship with many of these domains. For example, when we're talking about, let's say, the width of certain objects or certain places, or how we're designing the urban landscape, I think thinking about interactive nature of technology and how, again, that can come in and feed into many of these proposals becoming more adaptive, more interactive, and more responsive to the unique conditions of each of our users. I think for me, that is probably the way to go. And on the other hand, when I work with the body, I think a lot of them, again, going back to augmenting the body, a lot of this information which we think need to be embedded on site or embedded, again, throughout the city or in the body of the architecture, a lot of that can happen on the body of our users, which again can address their unique conditions. For example, if someone requires a certain sensory information regarding what is happening around them or like behind them or wherever, that could be happening over the body of the user. That could be in the format of a certain tactile feedback, which is mapped on the body, and the user is trained to understand and decode those information, and again, then map it onto their surrounding environment, which is something that we explored in our project called Saratis a couple of years ago. And I think, again, that might be more flexible ways of approaching many of these problems.
Yeah, I think too, in so many ways, we have a lot of questions still about the way we integrate technology into the built world. And, you know, if we can kind of start in a place of, you know, really thinking about how, you know, that integration isn't a world of scaffolds and screens or, you know, an Alexa that we kind of talk to, and start to think about it in ways that could be more productive and engaging, and bodies of all kinds and experiences of all kinds is a way, you know, where we can start to make headway. Because, you know, I think there's a lot of testing going on, but we don't really have a a singular standard for how we integrate technologies yet, or a method. It's all experimentation at this point. And so if we can really kind of push ideas forward, it allows a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, just going back to what Rachel just said about scaffolding, I think that is a great term, because like if we think about our bodies, they are the center of our conscious experience. So in a way, they could function as that scaffolding, which all of these augmenting tools can be applied to and address again our unique conditions and sensory abilities, or even action abilities, motor abilities.
I also have a small critique on technology personally, just because I think I rely so much on captions. Obviously, as a late deafened person, I do use sign language, but I started learning later in life rather than earlier in life. And so, you know, when it comes to technology, I definitely see like how it can be used as a tool in so many occasions and situations. But I do think when it comes to like the root of the problem, it's actually how the environment itself is built. And so sometimes when we implement technology in badly designed places, it sort of feels more like a band-aid than an actual fix for the environment as a whole, right? And so I think it's really important to sort of consider both sides of that equation, as far as like, how can we actually fix the root problem and then enhance it with technology, rather than just like pasting the technology over the problem, right? So, but yeah, I'm not anti-technology by any means. I rely on it too, but I just think, you know, there has to be kind of like a balance there, as far as like how we're solving the major underlying problems of like inaccessibility. So.
And I wonder, you know, how much, I mean, if you look at the technology of the wheelchair, it certainly, I mean, you have to consider the wheelchair as a piece of technology. One thing that we talked a lot about, well, actually not a ton about, but it came up as an interesting kind of discussion, was disclosure. How much does, you know, technology disclose somebody's level of ability without, you know, their permission to do so? I think as a non-disabled person, you really don't think about disclosure all that much at all. And it's something obviously extremely personal as to whether you do, or, you know, whether somebody does or does not want to disclose their level of ability if they consider themselves a disabled person, especially for something like autism, which is always tagged invisible disorder. But the other side to that I wanted to mention was in one of the people that we were working with, she is in a wheelchair, and you know, of course, she always gets the question of like, what's wrong with you? But there is this perspective, and I think the ADA exudes this, that like the wheelchair is a problem technology, and we need to be able to suit it. But, you know, there was a moment with this person, her name was Susan, where she said, somebody came up and said, like, you know, asked me, how is your wheelchair helpful for you? Or like, what's the, you know, what's the best value for your wheelchair? And she was like really surprised by the question. She's like, that's a great perspective, you know, to have, that this thing, you know, that she essentially enjoys being in this wheelchair. It is extremely, you know, it is a part of her life. It is a part of her being. And when the students were trying to design something that meant she could leave the wheelchair, she just confronted it, and she's like, look, the most comfortable place in the world is my wheelchair. I do not want to be out of it. I do not want to transition out of it. There are so many things, you know, there's so many hiccups in that process. There's so many difficulties in that process. And it's not that she feels she's bound to it. She's just like, that is my safe space. That is my comfortable moment. And you know, society really does not look at the wheelchair that way at all, right? Design does not look at the wheelchair that way at all. So I think like flipping that perspective is kind of one really important thing as a way to when we define technology, when we create technology.
Definitely. And I think like as far as your comment on, you know, people will call this type of technology assistive. I like to call it like adaptive, because sometimes, you know, in my case, I've been wearing hearing aids since I was like 8 years old. That's around the time I was like diagnosed. And so up until maybe like my early 20s, I was hiding my hearing aids completely. Like I didn't want them visible. And so there's a lot of stigma about assistive technology. And I think what you mentioned about, you know, disclosing disability and your identity, some people are definitely very uncomfortable about it. It's something that I sort of grew into more recently, where like I have like pretty, like I'm not wearing them right now. Obviously I take them on and off, but my hearing aids like are pretty massive actually. Like you can see them, they're not cochlear implants, but they're pretty big hearing aids. And so now I actually like them to be visible, which is funny because I've kind of totally changed my attitude towards it. I don't really know how that happened, probably just with my identity changing from, you know, more of the impairment point of view, more of the medical model view to like the social model view, where I've become proud at identifying as deaf. And so I like to have them visible in the sense that like people can see them and they realize, oh, she's deaf, I'm not going to bother her, or I'm not going to like try to like talk intelligibly, right? Like, so it's like, I mean, you'd be surprised how many times people don't even see them though either. And it's just gotten me into a lot of awkward situations. So in a sense, like they kind of help to I don't know, break the ice in a sense. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of like them to be visible now because, you know, invisible disabilities are another challenge in themselves because like you were mentioning, you know, with autistic folks, neurodivergent folks, like low vision and deaf and hard of hearing people, these disabilities are not visible all the time. And so we can face a lot of discrimination for that reason because, you know, I'm pretty non-disabled passing from the exterior. Like most people won't even know that I'm deaf unless they see my hearing aids or they see me signing with a deaf friend, or if I tell them explicitly, you know. And so with masks in particular with COVID, it's been a big challenge for me. And I know autistic folks as well have had trouble like reading cues, social cues with masks on. And so yeah, it's just, it can be a challenge as far as the technology is concerned. It definitely goes both ways. So.
Yeah, one phrase, we had a student who has a sister who I think she had Down syndrome. I'm honestly not sure, I can't totally recall, but it was more of a visible disability. And the one thing, and literally this was like one of the themes throughout the semester, was he just said, avoid the avoidance. You know, when recognizing it, it's like, somehow the response is to turn away. You know, and not necessarily in a mean way, but just like, I don't know, you know, what to do in this situation. So therefore I'm going to avoid it. Therefore I'm going to turn away. Therefore I'm going to look away. And he's just like, you know, avoid the avoidance. So we kept like, I mean, literally every class that would come up in a moment, it's like, well, as we said, avoid the avoidance, you know. Go say hi or whatever, you know, or, you know, continue the conversation or start the conversation, ask a question. Don't be afraid to ask even the wrong question, but just,
and I'm pretty open to, you know, like discussing disability with people now, but this has definitely happened kind of definitely over time as far as like my comfort with discussing my disability. And some people aren't comfortable discussing, and, you know, it's really a personal thing. But I think, you know, as far as like design is concerned, like with Deafscape, in particular for me, like having some of those principles implemented really makes me more comfortable in public space, also as a woman as well, because, you know, sometimes having those like scenarios, we created like the high backed bench, for example, which is one of my favorites. It's like, it takes away some of that extra stress, that extra fatigue that comes from like places that really aren't designed with that type of principle in mind, which most places aren't, you know. And so it's like, when we think about the built environment, I think we can really ameliorate some of that extra anxiety and stress that disabled people face in the built environment. And it's really quite simple to implement something like a high backed bench in a design. I mean, if you think about it, for me, it's just having that security at the back is one less thing that I have to stress about, like somebody like approaching me, like a stranger, just like coming at me from the back or something like that. It's really simple though, you know, there's simple tactics we can implement to help with that, that are, you know, apart from the assistive technology. It's just the design implementation instead. So.
I think that that was something that I also saw as an interesting overlap between the discussions, was how we sit. Because as Alexa, you're mentioning the high back bench and how you feel more protected behind you, and also Sean and Rachel both working with sitting itself and chairs. Ava, I didn't see anything particularly with chairs, but I don't know if now you're starting to think of it a bit more as you're realizing how important it is. I would guess right now we are all sitting. And I think that that's something that is so human in our lives, and chairs and how we sit. I don't know, it's very interesting because disabled people have to sit as well, and maybe sit in different ways than we do. And I think that that's something really worth designing more as architects into our environments. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I just saw it as such an interesting overlap.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could probably talk quite a bit about chairs and maybe why that arises in this conversation. I mean, I think we instantly accept chairs as an extension of our bodies. We even reference them similarly in language. They have legs and arms and backs and seats and so forth. And so there's a lot there, but I think with some of the experimental work that we do, or even, you know, some of we're doing some large rocking chairs in public space that are interactive right now as well. It's a lot about, you know, directly engaging the body as a kind of site of intervention. And, you know, that's interesting to me, and that I think we can really kind of rethink the way that we engage the body, maybe to Ava's kind of comments of rethinking standards and so forth. Like, if we use the body as a site of intervention, whether that's through chairs or wearable prosthetics or things of that nature that some of my students do, we can start to kind of rethink the way that we engage the world around us likewise. And so, you know, I think it becomes an interesting kind of testing ground that we're all fairly familiar with, in terms of, like, you know, like you said, we're kind of all sitting here talking via Zoom. And so, you know, how can we kind of rethink those things as a way to ultimately, you know, it doesn't always have to be a chair necessarily, but it becomes a testing ground to then think about it outside of the domain of the chair as well.
Yeah, I think that's really true. The chair is that like first step, but then there's what are those next steps, and how we continue to integrate these things into our built environment. We have about 13 minutes left, or 12 minutes. I just saw a clock change. So I want to get last statements from each of you and last thoughts, but also where is the further learning for our audience watching on YouTube? Do you have recommended readings or podcasts that you would recommend, or other ways for them to continue to learn about these topics? So if you have any last thoughts, please.
I might, just following up on what Rachel was talking about, I'd say like the thinking about the chair actually is kind of really, really interesting, like having a course just on chairs. And I think you know, there's obviously a history of architects designing chairs, and I guess I hadn't really thought about it, but that's maybe one of the more human-centered moments that the architect enters the discussion. And then once you go beyond the chair, then it's sort of enveloped in building and environment and so on. So for some reason, the architect has kind of claimed that little space of thinking about and designing the chair and its use. So maybe that is an avenue actually to have these discussions help enter into what architects normally think about. Just going beyond that to the students, I mean, I would say, you know, the things that are being discussed about here, you know, bring them up in conversations of your studio that's about housing or whatever it's, you know, about structural design, whatever it might be. I think that's the point, is like these kinds of things should be happening in those moments. They just don't. And so it usually happens in the little bubble of the things that we're teaching, and it doesn't, like I said before, radiate beyond that. So I would say, you know, put it to you if you feel a little bit more educated after today or after reading some of the works of everybody sitting here, then, you know, use that voice to bring up, and you don't have to act as an expert, but use that voice to bring up the questions that maybe have arisen from this discussion. How does that play into to, you know, what you're doing in a more kind of normative studio environment? I mean, this was sort of discussed earlier about programming. That was one really sad thing that I saw when reviewing graduate applications. Like, there wasn't a single project that addressed anything in an innovative way. I mean, there was, the biggest stretch was like the community center. And you know, that's been a kind of common theme of projects for a long time, and hasn't really changed in the way it's considered. So I was really saddened that, like, you know, studios aren't confronting these issues in one way or another. Like, it's just not changing the kind of programs and kind of, you know, function that the work that students do. So maybe the way to do that is more of a grassroots kind of, how can students start to grow these ideas through their work that might be a more kind of normative program that they've been given.
I want to say I second what you said, Sean, about you know, academia. It really starts there and then kind of infiltrates practice. I think that's how it worked for me as well, you know, alongside my personal experience and my identity. And I think, you know, one scenario that I like to share with people is, you know, at Berkeley, when the disability rights movement was happening, we have a professor that is now an emeritus named Raymond Liptray, and he actually led a studio at Worcester Hall at Berkeley that brought physically disabled people into the studio to critique architecture students' project. And, you know, sadly, that hasn't really been replicated since. That was like in the 70s. And so just thinking about that process and like how we could bring it back just really intrigues me. And, you know, I hope it starts to happen at a broader scale eventually. But I did have a couple, I have some resources up on my website, Virginia. I'm going to drop that link in our chat. But there were 2 books that I particularly recommend as far as access is concerned. But one of them is called Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability. And that's written by Dr. Amy Hamray. They're at Vanderbilt University. And the second one is a little bit more light and reading. It's like more conversational, but it's called Disability, Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century. And that's edited by Alice Wong, the disabled person. And so both of these books are really good places to start, I think, to think about both, you know, access in the built environment and then like personal experience coming into play. So.
Yeah, thank you. We'll definitely copy those into our YouTube chat so that viewers can continue to learn beyond just listening to this panel. Ava, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking that just listening to everyone's thoughts, I want to just touch on the topic of, again, going back to how we think about standards and how disability for many people might not just be something, again, as Alexa was mentioning, something visible, but maybe something much more personal. The experience of many immigrants, queer bodies, women of color, many of those experiences can be considered and in many ways similar to disabled bodies and how they interact with their built environments and the city or many other conditions. So I think just by opening up these conversations, we allow, again, that diversity of human experience to be exposed and become the center of our design explorations. And if I want to maybe introduce some resources, I would say, in line with what I just mentioned, again, the Cyborg Manifesto, the Xenofeminist Manifesto, and Glitch Feminism might be some good resources to maybe start with.
Yeah, I would just add, there's a great version of log called Disorienting Phenomenology. It's one of the editions of log where they really go into, how we might think about experiences relative to kind of social, cultural, race, gender, disability, and so forth, as a whole kind of collection of written works that's worth reading. And then I would say, digging outside of the discipline of architecture is important as well. Like, for us to be talking about the body, we have to understand the body, beyond just our own experiences. And so, with some of the work that we've done, we've, dug into extensive reading about, yoga and conscious breathing and those sorts of things, and in terms of PTSD and the effects of the kind of physical and psychological kind of components. And so I think, not just referencing precedent within architecture isn't important, and looking outside of it into other domains and into the art world at times as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really, that kind of wraps up the conversation back to the architect's ego and things like this, because I think we're seeing architecture becoming a more collaborative practice. At least I hope so, that we are bringing in, I know Sean works with like neuroscientists, and you're working with different groups as well, and working with dancers and all these different disciplines that can come together. So I think collaboration is really part of this future that's going to be super important, whether it's collaborating with people with disabilities, but also collaborating with people in the sciences, collaborating with people in the arts as well, and learning from their approaches to make architecture better is really important, because architecture typically tends to last for a long time. And so these built environments need to be withstanding and adaptable to our changing ideas of our bodies. And, I think even when you look at standards, the standards were written so many years ago that our bodies have changed, right? Nutrition has changed. The way that we grow is very different than what it was when these things were written. And so I think that we are learning so much and always changing. And I think that we really need to be adaptive in the future much more. So I want to thank our speakers one last time. So thank you so much, Alexa, Ava, Rachel, and Sean, for all of the discussion today. And thank you also for Jonathan for sending a video, because even though he couldn't engage in this discussion, just seeing the work has been really good to expose and discuss. And I really hope that we can continue this discussion further. So please stay in touch, and stay in touch with each other, and keep the conversation going. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Yep, thank you, Virginia.
Thank you.
And thank you. This is our last discussion on inclusivity, but we really hope at Digital Futures to have more of these. And I want to thank our team here, Gustavo, Biana, and Marina, who led discussions all week long on the various topics of inclusivity, and just having these open discussions has been so important. So thank you again to our team, and we'll continue. Bye-bye.